Several years ago, we were here at the Miami Book Fair International, and a friend of mine said, I want you to meet a poet friend of mine. I think he'd make a good interview for your show. Well, it was the end of the day, and we did about 7 or 8 interviews that day, and you came in, and we sat and talked, and I just had a good time talking to you. A couple of weeks later, I'm watching the inauguration of President Obama in 2013, yes. And there on the stage, there you are. No, 2 weeks earlier, you didn't even give a clue that you were going to be the poet laureate of the United States.
I didn't know. Actually, I got the call on December 12th, and the inauguration was on January 21st, so I didn't know myself.
So when you got the call, did you believe it?
No.
Or did you think somebody was pranking you?
At first, I didn't even understand what they were trying to tell me. It's the Presidential Inaugural Committee. I thought they wanted me to read a poem in the White House or something like that. So I Googled the name of the person, and it did come up as Presidential Inaugural Committee. So I knew it was for real.
So what did you think when you said, "Hey, this is no joke. They're serious"? What went through your mind?
Surprisingly, my first thought was an incredible sense of gratitude, thinking about my family, my parents and my grandparents, and their journeys as immigrants, exiles, sacrifices, and the hard work that they made, and their for me and for my brother, and their insistence on education, and that whole sort of American dream thing. That moment that just happened was only possible because of them. And it surprised me that was my initial reaction. But it's this overwhelming sense of gratitude, because in some ways I felt like I finished their story and could begin mine or the story they started for me.
After you realized what was just been offered to you, who was the first person you called to tell?
You're not allowed to tell anybody, so they have to make the news official.
It's Inauguration Day, with January 20th, and there you are driving to the Capitol where the ceremony is going to be. What was that whole scene like?
Oh, I'm not driving. I'm like you see in the movies, like black SUVs with the lights. The whole city shut down. I had done all I can. I was happy and with the poem, at least something I felt I could be proud of, and it was time to do it. And a little surprising as well is that you realize you're part of something much larger. There's really this incredible, palpable sense of reverence that happens at the inauguration, which to me is like, we do fireworks and all that, the 4th of July, and it's just there's no sense of, it's just going through the motions. But the inauguration really is essentially who we are as a democracy. That transfer of power, which you can imagine what that felt like, a few hundred years ago, like how groundbreaking that was, but you still feel it. And the power of witness of those a million people out on the national malls bearing witness to this transfer of power. And it's like to remind us, president and ourselves, of who we are and the choices and commitments that we made to do that. And so you realize you're part of something much larger.
Here you are, you're on this stage with all these historical figures. Did you get an opportunity to schmooze with anybody, or did everybody just do their part and not talk?
There are different opportunities to schmooze. I think it was a couple months later as a sort of an official thank you. So yeah, there was schmoozing, and then did a lot of interviews.
What happened next? How did your life change as a result of being seen by 100 million people on television?
Part of me still sort of felt that I, as a little Cuban chubby gay kid from Miami, that I wasn't part of the American narrative, or completely unsure, but I still felt something like, is this really my country? Do I really belong here? Or am I going to live here the rest of my, that kind of feeling, not sure you belong. And that moment confirmed something very important for me, which was that's exactly those kinds of narratives have always been part of what America is. That we're part of this grand story. That narrative hasn't been obviously acknowledged and for the most part ignored or even oppressed. So that was one important thing. I found a place at the American table, so to speak, finally. And then the other part was it changed my idea of my sense of what poetry could do, or poetry's place in America.
What is poetry's place in America?
Well, I had sort of tossed my hands up in the air, and kind of like most of us have done, and say, poetry is not for everyone. It's a vocation. It's poets and the work that we do, but it is what it is, and we've kind of resigned ourselves to thinking that poetry can't occupy the public consciousness in the ways that maybe we wished it would. But that moment is so public. I mean, it's 40 million people It's the one moment. It's arguably the most public moment of poetry in America, right? Open the door for me to go to all these places that suddenly we're opening their door to poetry. I think, hey, I understood that poem, and I felt part of that poem, and this isn't like the stuff we were reading in high school, right? That changed. So that changed my perception of poetry, and that changed also my career and how I write, or I say not how I write, but the subjects I've been writing about. So I spend most of the time, doing readings, lectures, appearances, poetry now at the USDA and the FDIC and like Silicon Valley. Response is usually positive. It's just that they've not, some people will say like, oh, I don't get poetry. And I'll ask them, when was the last time you read a poem? They're like, oh, I haven't read a poem in 30 years. I'm like, well, it's not that you don't get poetry. It's just you haven't read poetry and you haven't maybe found the right poet either that speaks to you, because we don't have to love all poetry. I see poetry coming back to a little more about engaging the world in a more active, in a more purposeful way.
And where do you see your role in the bigger picture, based on what you've accomplished and the recognition and everything? What part do you want to play in the future of poetry?
I'm already playing those parts. I've used this platform, like I said, to get poetry in the door of the oddest places. Like, the weirder it is, the more I'll do it for free, because to just have people experience poetry and in that creates sort of a kind of change the public consciousness of perception, I should say, of what poetry is. That's one thing. The other thing is I work first appointed education ambassador for the Academy of American Poets, and what I do is they have amazing resources for educators just teaching contemporary work. We can walk out of high school these days without ever reading a living poet, and that's a disservice. I'm not saying you got to throw out the old stuff, but you got to realize that the poetry that's relevant right in our communities, written by poets in our communities about issues that affect us all.
And you're still writing poetry.
And I'm writing.
What's your latest book?
Well, I've been writing a lot of commission poems, but some of them are it's called commissions, but it's not something they're not necessarily paying you anything. So I wrote the poem for the reopening of the U.S. Embassy in Havana and read it there. Poems for Freedom to Marry, a lot of activist organizations. So I'm using what I know to do, but I figure I can use my words to help organizations do what they do best. So that's the way I've been trying to do poems. Wrote a poem for Boston Strong after the marathon bombings that I read at the opening of the benefit concert. So trying to put poetry out there in that way, that's one. And they're poems that I've written, my own original poems. And then my latest book is called Boundaries. It's photography with poetry. So it's 12 photographs by Jacob Hessler, who's the main photographer, and 12 poems by myself on the theme of boundaries. And I think poetry and poets in general, what they're always looking at is in the gray spaces, because life is so nuanced, and just like our lives are rarely black and white, right? We negotiate a lot of things, and I think poets are good at getting us to look at the other nuances and complexities that we really need to look at if we're really going to talk about this.
So it sounds like your new mission is to use poetry, but really to talk to people about how we can be better.
Yeah. Ironically, it also sort of connects to my sense of otherness in America, because the idea of home and belonging, community, nation, heritage are things that were always a question for me since I was a little boy, because I was Cuban American. There's this place that we came from that we might go back to. There's this America that I sort of belong to. So in a way, the question of the immigrant, the exile, is sort of the perpetual is also the American question. So even though I'm writing these things about the United States, in some ways, it's also about my personal journey and story about trying to find my place in this conversation as well.
Well, you've had an amazing journey and a great story, and I hope it's just the beginning and continues further, and we can have more conversations like this. So thank you.
My pleasure. Yes, man. I got a lot of work to do, thank God.